So I've made videos before about why there's a significant amount of suffering in life and a lot more than most people tend to think. In this video, I want to focus on a different aspect of our life, and that's whether it has any meaning. Now, there are different ways that people can kind of use the term meaning, and I do think there are some smaller ways that we can create meaning in our life. But I think the grand way that people mean when they say meaning is there any ultimate meaning to our lives? Is there any ultimate point to our lives out there that we can find? Is there something we will eventually come across and realize that's the point to all of this? That's why we exist. And in that sense, I don't think there is any meaning to our lives. I think our lives are pointless. And to explore this and some of the implications, we're going to be using two books in particular, which are The Meaning of It All by Professor Rivka Weinberg and The Human Predicament, which is by Professor David Benatar. Now, Rivka Weinberg argues that when we think of this sort of ultimate meaning that we want our lives to have, what we're really yearning for is our lives to have some sort of ultimate point. And her conclusion is that our lives just can't have an ultimate point, because for something to have a point, the activity that you're doing, which in this case is leading a life, has to be grounded in or oriented towards some value or goal that sits outside of the activity itself. But the problem is, though, is that obviously the only values in the universe are values created by value havers, which are us, sentient beings. And so the values that we have and create aren't outside of ourselves, they're not outside of our lives. Now, that doesn't mean that everything in life is pointless. The things we do in life can have a point. So you peel carrots because you want to create a meal, because you want to sort of maintain and service your health, because you value your well-being. There is a point to peeling the carrots because it ultimately serves to further something you value, which is your well-being. Is there any ultimate point to all of this? No, but there is a point within your life of peeling the carrots. Another example is if you spend time with friends. If you spend time with friends, you value that interaction because you value human connection. And if you go a bit deeper, maybe you could say you value human connection because it enhances your sense of well-being. But the project of leading a life itself is fundamentally different from spending time with friends or peeling carrots, because those two things have a point because they're grounded in something you value. But the point of your life precedes what you value, and so the values you have can't ground the point of leading a life at all. That's the fundamental point that Rivka Weinberg makes, and why she says that it's actually impossible to have an ultimate point to our lives, because where would it come from? Now, some people say that gods exist, or a specific god exists, and they are external to us, and so they provide the sort of grounding or orientation that can give our lives a point, i.e. the point of our lives is to do whatever God created us for. But Weinberg explains that there are kind of a few problems with this way of trying to address our problem of meaning. The first is that it just simply isn't clear that any gods exist, and claiming that they do and that their existence provides a solution to sort of many of our philosophical problems just seems way too convenient and something we should be extremely skeptical of. The second reason is that even if they did exist, they actually wouldn't solve the problem in the way that theists think that they would, because the existence of gods or a god simply just moves where the problem of ultimate meaning sits. So instead of asking what's the ultimate point of our lives, you could just say what's the ultimate point of serving God's will or serving the purpose that God had provided us. It just kicks the can down the road. But thirdly, even if you could say, okay, yes, gods definitely exist and they do definitely somehow solve the problem of our lives having a point, there's actually a third sort of larger problem that this isn't going to solve. And that's that even if the existence of a god or gods did provide our lives with some sort of ultimate meaning, the ultimate meaning we're yearning for is an ultimate meaning that is actually satisfying. But many people wouldn't find that kind of ultimate meaning satisfying. Like, to give an example to explain this, let's take an example that is relatively well known from Robert Nozick. Imagine we somehow discover that our lives do have some ultimate point, some ultimate meaning. And the point of our lives is actually that we have been cultivated and grown as a civilization by some sort of spacefaring alien species that is one day going to come and harvest us for food. That would provide us with an ultimate point to our lives. There is a reason that we all exist and we are all here. There is a meaning to all of this. But it's not a particularly satisfying one. It's not one that makes you feel good about the point of your life. And likewise, many people just don't believe that gods exist, or if they do, they believe in different gods to the one that some specific person is going to posit. So neither of these groups of people are going to find this satisfying. And then you've got groups of people who look around themselves at the world and think, there's so much suffering in the world. Is a god that would have allowed all this to happen or made all this happen, are they a respectful kind of god? Should I respect their will and purpose? Would I feel satisfied in carrying out the point that they've given my life? So trying to posit that gods exist actually just doesn't solve the problem of meaning at all. And as far as we have good reason to believe, we are, as David Benatar says in his book, The Human Predicament, ephemeral beings on a tiny planet in one of hundreds of billions of galaxies in the universe. And this universe is indifferent to us, to all of our hopes and fears and the things that we want and want to avoid, to justice and injustice, all of it, it's indifferent towards. But then, okay, so our lives are ultimately meaningless. But is this actually a bad thing? Because some people might look at that and think, okay, well, there's no ultimate meaning to our life. There's no ultimate point to our lives. But then surely that kind of frees us up and means that we kind of have a blank canvas to do whatever we want with our lives. Because if there was some ultimate point to our lives, we would kind of feel some sense of duty or pull towards having to live in accordance with that point. And whilst that is true, I actually think, and Rivka Weinberg argues, that actually we should kind of be regretful about the fact that our lives just don't have a point. We put a significant amount of work and energy into living our lives, not just in like the projects and the relationships and the things that we choose to pursue in life, but actually just into leading a life itself. Again, David Benatar describes us as not altogether different from a hamster on its wheel. Much of our lives are filled with recurring mundane activities, the purpose of which is to keep the whole cycle going. Working, shopping, cooking, feeding, dishwashing, bill paying, the list goes on. We also stress about quite a lot of the details of our lives. So in his essay, The Absurd, the American philosopher Thomas Nagel asks us to think about how much the average person or the ordinary person kind of sweats over things like their health, their sex life, the quality of their relationships. There are so many aspects of our lives that are part and parcel of living a life that we sweat so much over and have so much anxiety around over the course of our life. And over the course of a lifetime, that is a lot of frustration. And then there's just simply the brute fact that existence comes with a lot of suffering over the course of our lives. And again, I will link the videos in the description below where I've gone over the amount of suffering in our lives, and you can check that out. So it's completely reasonable to want something that you put a lot of effort into and there's a lot of anxiety around and that comes with a lot of suffering. It's reasonable to want there to be some sort of point behind that. And the fact that it's actually ultimately pointless is kind of sad. I mean, think about the reverse of all of this. What if all of the striving and the suffering and the anxiety and the work, what if behind that there was some sort of grand, satisfying, righteous purpose? That'd be a way better situation to be in. But the actual case we're in is that it doesn't take much distance to just step back, look upon everything that happens in our lives and everything in life generally and think, it seems kind of futile. We chase our goals, and when we get them, they're replaced by new goals, and that happens until we die, and then we create another generation who do the same thing, and this all happens until the human species goes extinct, and it's all basically for nothing. But okay, so there's no ultimate meaning to our lives, there's no point to all of this, and that is something that we should be sad about. But how do we respond to this? Now, there are all sorts of ways that we should respond to this, and we haven't even fully gone over everything to do with meaning in our lives. I just wanted to focus on this sort of grander sense. And there are loads of different ways that we can respond to it. But there's one specific response that I want to highlight here. And to get into that, I'm going to pass over to David Benatar with a segment from an interview he did with Brain in a Vat.
If we are in the situation where our lives are less meaningful than we would like them to be, and there are all these other kind of ills that come along with existence, the sort of daily pains, the horror of death, the sort of immense suffering, what are we to do given our human predicament?
Well, not make more humans. That's the first thing, because once you recognize that this whole thing is ultimately pointless, that there's all this striving, all this hardship, and it might have some benefits for people immediately around, but it ultimately is pointless. I think you would say, let's just not keep this going. This is ridiculous, just to generate more meaning seekers, more beings to face adversity.
Now, some people might think that actually creating a child might alleviate our meaning predicament, because creating a child is a way that we can create meaning for ourselves in our lives, because we can actually create meaning for ourselves, which is something we haven't gone over in this video. And it's true that one of the ways that we as individuals can cope with the lack of meaning of our lives is that we can create meaning in our lives, and one of those ways is by creating a child. But that doesn't justify creating a child. There are so many different ways that you can create meaning in your life, and creating a child isn't the only one. And on top of that, when you create a child, you're creating someone who's going to suffer to a significant degree, and you're imposing that suffering on them. And that doesn't seem justified to create meaning in your own life. But the second reason is that by creating a child to solve or alleviate, because I don't actually think it solves your meaning problem, but it helps alleviate your meaning problem, is that you're setting up a dynamic of essentially a Ponzi scheme, where each generation creates the next generation to help alleviate their own problem, not even solve their own problem. But by doing that, you simply reproduce the problem into the next generation, so that they then have to create another generation to help alleviate their problem that you've imposed on them. But along with that, you create all of the suffering that that generation will then experience. It would be better simply to not create the next generation so that they have to bear the burden of a lack of meaning and a presence of suffering. And instead what we do is follow Peter Vessel-Zapp's advice when he says, "Know yourselves, be infertile, and let the earth be silent after ye." Let me know what you think in the comments below. Have I missed anything? And I'll see you in the next one.